The walls of the prison were not merely gray, they pulsed with the slow rhythm of despair. Time inside them did not pass, it decayed. For Luna, every minute was a splinter pressing deeper into the skin of her sanity. What had once been a woman of light and defiance was now only a trembling silhouette of her former self, pacing the narrow corridor between rage and remorse. She had learned to live without tenderness, but not without memory. And it was memory, cruel, vivid, unrelenting, that finally broke her. The photographs arrived without warning. A guard, whose smile lingered too long for it to be professional, slid an envelope under her cell door during the early hours of the morning. Luna hesitated before picking it up, fearing instinctively that whatever lay inside would change something irreversibly. When she finally unfolded the glossy sheets, the air left her lungs. There they were, Will and Electra, bathed in sunlight, laughing with the kind of ease Luna had forgotten existed. His hand rested on Electra's waist. Her eyes glowed with contentment. It was an image of life moving forward without her, of love reborn from the ashes of betrayal. The walls of her cell seemed to tilt. The sound of her own pulse drowned everything else. For a long while she said nothing. Then, as the numbness melted into a sharp, unbearable ache, Luna realized that she would not survive this humiliation quietly. She had always been a strategist, a woman who could turn pain into power. The moment she saw those photographs, she began constructing what she called Plan B, the unthinkable backup she had sworn never to use. Her first plan had been patience, good behavior, cooperation, and early release. But the photographs obliterated patience. They erased hope and replaced it with something darker. The child growing inside her had been her last tie to Will, the last fragment of something pure in a life stained with regret. Now, even that was slipping away. If she could not hold him through love, she would bind him through tragedy. In the dim light of her cell, Luna pressed a trembling hand against her abdomen. The guards thought she was praying, but she was calculating. She began refusing meals, overexerting herself during the mandatory labor shifts, feigning dizziness until it became real. Within days, her body began to respond to the cruelty of her will. The pain started as a dull pull in her lower stomach, then sharpened until it consumed her. When the blood came, the alarm followed. Chaos erupted in the corridor. Guards shouted. Someone called for the warden. By the time they carried her out on a stretcher, Luna's consciousness flickered like a candle fighting the wind, but behind her half-closed eyelids was a spark of grim satisfaction. The plan had worked. She was out. The hospital lights were mercilessly bright. Beeping monitors filled the air with a sterile rhythm, each one a reminder that she was still alive when she almost wished she wasn't. Doctors surrounded her, voices urgent, but Luna's mind drifted elsewhere, to Will, to the possibility that the news had reached him. She knew he wouldn't ignore a call like this. He was too good, too responsible, too bound by guilt to turn away from her suffering. It was that weakness, the softness of his conscience, that she had always known how to exploit. Hours later, he arrived. The nurses had prepared the consent forms. The attending physician explained that the baby's heartbeat was fading, that without immediate surgery both mother and child would die. Will stood frozen, every word slicing through the fog of his confusion. His name was on the line marked father. His signature would decide 2 lives. Luna's condition, the doctor said, was fragile. They needed consent for an emergency procedure. Will's hands shook as he took the pen. The ink bled slightly onto the paper, just enough to blur the last letter of his name. When he looked up, Luna's eyes were open, weak, glassy, but aware. The expression on her face was not gratitude, it was possession. The surgery lasted hours. When it was over, the doctor emerged with a look that was neither triumphant nor defeated. The baby was alive, but only barely. Luna herself had nearly slipped away. For a moment, the sterile world of the hospital dissolved into a blur for Will. He felt the walls closing in, the air too thin to breathe. He thought of Electra, of the promises he had made to her, the fragile peace they had tried to build. But all of it seemed distant now, like a dream fading at dawn. What mattered, at least for that moment, was the life he had just agreed to protect and the woman who had nearly died bringing it into the world. When they allowed him to see Luna, she looked like a ghost stitched together with tubes and wires. Her skin was pale, lips cracked, but her eyes still held that terrible strength he had always both admired and feared. On the tray beside her bed lay a tiny blanket, the one they had wrapped the baby in. Will reached out, touching it with hesitant reverence. He thought of what could have been if things had gone differently, if love had not turned into this labyrinth of pain and obligation. The nurse whispered that the baby was in the neonatal unit, fighting to breathe. Will nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. Days turned into weeks. The hospital became his new prison, a place of quiet corridors and unbearable waiting. Every time he visited the neonatal ward, he felt his soul fracture a little more. The child was impossibly small, encased in a glass box, tubes running from its fragile body like threads of fate. Will whispered apologies through the barrier of plastic, knowing the baby couldn't hear, but needing to say them anyway. He had failed Luna, failed this child, failed everyone he had ever loved. Electra came once, unannounced. She stood at the doorway of Luna's room, frozen by the sight of Will holding the infant's blanket. There was a depth to his sorrow that she had never seen before, and in that moment, she understood that she had already lost him. He didn't need to say the words. His grief had already chosen its home. Without confrontation, without tears, Electra turned and left, her footsteps silent against the polished floor. By the time Luna was discharged, she was different. The chaos had stripped her of pretense. Her beauty, once magnetic, now carried the brittle edge of survival. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each step might shatter the illusion of being alive. Will arranged everything, the transport, the paperwork, the room in a small rehabilitation center near the edge of town. It wasn't love that drove him now. It was penance. Every night, when he sat by her bed, he told himself that he owed her this, that after everything they had been through, he couldn't abandon her again. But deep down, another truth gnawed at him. He stayed because he no longer knew how to leave. Luna, meanwhile, understood the fragile nature of her victory. Will's presence was not the same as his devotion. He was there out of guilt, not desire. But guilt could be a powerful ally if nurtured correctly. She began to weave a narrative of redemption, one that made her the victim of circumstance and him the reluctant savior. Whenever he faltered, she reminded him of the night in the hospital, of how his signature had saved 2 lives. She used her scars as symbols of sacrifice, her silence as a tool of manipulation. Slowly, imperceptibly, she bound him closer, not with affection, but with emotional debt. Electra's absence became a shadow that neither of them dared to mention. The house that Will had once shared with her grew cold, its rooms echoing with memories too painful to revisit. He spent most of his time at Luna's side, convincing himself that this was temporary, that someday, when the child was strong enough, he would find a way to reconcile the life he had lost with the one he had inherited. But Luna had no intention of letting him go. The baby, whom she named Hope, became the centerpiece of their fragile truce, a living reminder of both their sins and their salvation. Nights were the hardest. When the baby's cries echoed through the small apartment, Will would rise, pacing the floor, rocking the infant in his arms until exhaustion blurred his thoughts. Sometimes he would catch Luna watching him from the bed, her gaze unreadable. There were moments when he thought he saw remorse in her eyes, but it would vanish as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something colder, calculation, perhaps, or fear of losing control. As months passed, Will's sense of self eroded further. The man who had once believed in second chances now lived on autopilot, moving through days defined by responsibility and nights haunted by regret. He had traded love for obligation, peace for penance. And yet, in a twisted way, he felt closer to Luna than ever before, not because he forgave her, but because their pain had fused into something unbreakable. They were bound not by hope, but by the wreckage of what they had destroyed. The turning point came one evening when the hospital called about the baby's health. Hope had developed complications. Will rushed to the emergency room, his heart pounding with the same terror he had felt months before. As he stood outside the neonatal unit, watching doctors surround the tiny form of his child, something inside him broke completely. He realized that no amount of guilt, no self-inflicted punishment, would ever undo the past. The life he had built around Luna was a monument to failure, a prison of his own making. When the doctors told him the baby would recover, he felt no relief, only emptiness. He looked at Luna, who stood beside him, tears glistening but eyes sharp with triumph. That was when he finally understood. She had never lost control. She had orchestrated everything, the pregnancy, the manipulation, even the tragedy, to keep him tethered. When they returned home, Will watched her cradle the baby, humming softly. There was tenderness in her tone, but also possession. He knew then that leaving her would mean abandoning his child, and staying would mean surrendering what was left of himself. It was a choice between two forms of loss, and Will, exhausted, chose the quieter one. He stayed. In the silence of that choice, Luna smiled. She had won, not the kind of victory that brings joy, but the kind that ensures survival. And as the night deepened, she whispered to the sleeping infant words that only she could hear, a promise or perhaps a warning, that love, when broken, could still be rebuilt, but only from the ruins of another's heart. Weeks bled into months, and the fragile calm that Will had constructed began to crack like porcelain left too long under pressure. The apartment he shared with Luna had become an echo chamber of half-spoken thoughts and sleepless nights. The walls held the sound of the baby's cries, the hum of the refrigerator, and the unrelenting silence that followed each argument. He no longer recognized the man in the mirror, a figure with hollow eyes, unshaven face, and the kind of fatigue that went beyond the body. The guilt that had once driven him to stay now began to suffocate him. He often wandered the streets at dawn, long after Luna had fallen asleep. The city at that hour seemed mercifully indifferent to his turmoil. He would stop at a park bench, staring at the horizon, as if waiting for something to break the fog inside him. Some mornings, he caught his reflection in the shop windows and almost didn't stop walking, as though the man he saw wasn't worth returning to. Yet each time, the thought of the child, tiny, fragile, utterly innocent, pulled him back. Hope was the only anchor left in a life adrift, and even that name felt cruelly ironic now. Luna, for her part, had mastered the art of appearing fragile. To outsiders, she looked like a woman rebuilding her life, delicate, humble, grateful for every kindness. But beneath that facade burned the same calculating fire that had once driven her to orchestrate the pregnancy. She watched Will with quiet precision, studying every hesitation, every flicker of guilt, and she knew she still owned him. Her victory was not in his affection, but in his dependence. He was trapped, and she was the one who held the key. Yet even Luna could not silence the ghosts forever. Sometimes, when she rocked Hope to sleep, she saw flashes of her old life, the mistakes, the betrayals, the reckless choices that had led her here. The faces of those she had hurt drifted through her mind like unfinished sentences. There were nights when she woke gasping, convinced she heard Electra's laughter echoing from the hallway. The prison walls might have vanished, but they lived on inside her. Electra's absence became its own haunting presence. She had disappeared from Will's life without confrontation, but she hadn't disappeared from the world. Somewhere, she was still out there, carrying her grief in silence. Friends whispered that she had moved across the city, that she was working with an outreach foundation for women, that she had started painting again. But rumors were like mist, visible, shapeless, impossible to hold. For Will, she existed in memories, the smell of her perfume on old sheets, the way her laughter used to warm a room, the way she looked at him like he was more than the sum of his mistakes. As winter settled over the city, Will found himself standing one night outside an art gallery, drawn by a name on the poster. Electra Vance, Fragments of Light. He hadn't meant to come. His feet simply carried him there. The paintings inside were quiet, melancholy things, abstract swirls of color and light that spoke of brokenness and survival. And in every stroke of paint, he saw their story. When she appeared across the room, time folded in on itself. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes still held that same impossible mixture of strength and vulnerability. Their gaze met, and in that instant, words were useless. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to undo what had been done, but all he could do was stare. Electra turned away first, her movements graceful but distant. He didn't follow. When he returned home that night, Luna was awake, waiting. She didn't need to ask where he had been. The smell of cold air and regret clung to him like confession. Her eyes darkened, not with jealousy, but with fear. The kind of fear that comes when power begins to slip. The next day, she doubled her efforts. She became affectionate, attentive, even tender. She began planning outings for the three of them, dressing Hope in bright colors, smiling at strangers, pretending to be the woman she thought Will might still want her to be. But the performance exhausted her, and cracks began to show. Will, though he said nothing, noticed the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee, the way her eyes sometimes darted to the window as if expecting someone to appear. He began to wonder whether she was unraveling, or if he was. The boundaries between guilt and manipulation blurred until he couldn't tell which one he was living under. One evening, after putting Hope to bed, Luna stood by the window, staring out at the rain. The streetlights painted her face in shifting patterns of light and shadow. "Do you ever wish you hadn't signed that paper?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the question hit Will like a knife. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. He knew the answer, and she did too. From that moment, a silent war began between them. A war fought not with words but with memory, silence, and the unspoken knowledge that love had long since rotted into something poisonous. Days later, Hope fell ill again. It was a minor infection, the doctors said, but for Will it was enough to rip open every wound that had just begun to heal. He spent nights at her bedside, refusing to leave even when Luna insisted he rest. Exhaustion carved new lines into his face, and when the fever finally broke, he wept quietly, not from relief but from the realization that he had become a man whose entire life revolved around waiting for disaster. Electra reached out to him not long after. Her message was brief, an inquiry about hope, a line of sympathy, but it reignited something he had buried. They met once, secretly, at a quiet cafe near the river. The conversation was polite, measured, but beneath it flowed a torrent of emotion. Will confessed his regret, not seeking forgiveness, but release. Electra listened, her eyes glistening but steady. When she finally spoke, her words were gentle but final. She told him she had loved him once, deeply, but love built on pain could never survive. She wished him peace, not reunion. And then she left, her silhouette dissolving into the misty twilight. When Will returned home that night, Luna knew. She could smell the foreign perfume on his coat, could read the guilt in his silence. The rage that followed was cold, surgical. She didn't scream or cry. Instead, she began packing a small bag. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, efficient and expressionless. Will watched, paralyzed, unable to stop her. He thought she might be leaving, but when she reached the crib, she lifted the baby and turned to him with eyes devoid of tears. "If I go," she said softly, "you lose her too." The threat hung between them like a noose. Will stepped forward, hands trembling, trying to reason, but Luna had already made her decision. She wasn't leaving to free herself, she was leaving to make sure he never could. In the days that followed, she disappeared with Hope, leaving no forwarding address. Police reports were filed, but Luna was clever. She had spent months preparing for this. By the time they traced her, she was living under a new name in a small coastal town, posing as a widow rebuilding her life. For Will, the loss hollowed him. He sold the apartment, quit his job, and spent months searching, his obsession consuming what was left of his sanity. Each clue that led nowhere deepened the wound. He wrote letters to Electra he never sent, apologies that grew longer and more desperate, until the words themselves lost meaning. Meanwhile, Luna built a new identity, yet peace eluded her. The nights were filled with whispers, the cries of the child echoing through her dreams. She began to see Will's face everywhere, in strangers, in reflections, in the quiet spaces between her own thoughts. The guilt she had so carefully suppressed began to bloom like rot under her skin. She told herself she had done everything for love, but even she no longer believed it. Love was not what had driven her. It was fear of being forgotten. 2 years passed before Will found her. By then, Hope was walking, her laughter a sound that could both heal and destroy him. The reunion was not cinematic. It was raw, painful, stripped of pretense. Luna stood frozen on the porch as he approached, her face pale with disbelief. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, without warning, she broke down, collapsing into sobs that were part confession, part surrender. She told him everything: the photos, the plan, the manipulation. She expected fury, but Will simply looked at her with exhaustion too deep for hatred. He told her that forgiveness was impossible, but compassion was all that remained. They decided to share custody of Hope, but the damage was already irreversible. Luna's health deteriorated. The years of guilt and stress had left invisible scars. Will visited her often, more caretaker than partner. When she died quietly one winter morning, he was there, holding her hand. Her final words were a whisper. "You were right to sign the paper." After the funeral, Will took Hope to the same park where he had once wandered at dawn. The air was cold but clean. He watched his daughter chase the falling leaves and felt, for the first time in years, a glimmer of peace. The past would never be undone, but it could be survived. He looked up at the sky, gray, endless, indifferent, and understood that some love stories are not meant to be saved, only remembered.